In French popular parlance, to represent, means to proudly fly the colors of those who can't make it to the party. Representing Australia at the Paris Paralympics is new Governor General Sam Mostyn. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Well, thank you for having me, François.
The Paralympics, there is this Olympic fever we had. Those who skip town during the summer are having remorse at this point, and there is this buzz around it. What do the Paralympics mean to you?
Well, I think for any Australian, the Paralympics have a very special place in our hearts. We've been represented, Australians have been at the Paralympics since 1960, and in fact one of the first representatives was a First Nations man who then set the course for full representation in our Paralympic team. But I think it says something about the fact that we come off the back of these wildly successful Olympics. It was delightful that both France and Australia secured the same amount of gold medals, although I think we nudged you out just slightly on total, but it was nice to be there with you on medal count. And I think what the Paralympics does is remind us that this isn't just an able-bodied celebration. We get crazy about Olympics, but Paralympics tell us something about those that should have always been at the table with sport. And this is a moment where we get to celebrate those that have overcome extraordinary adversity to then represent their country. And their primary aim is excellence and real intent to represent their country. That's why I'm delighted to be here representing all Australians, because it's important that we pay as much attention to the para-athletes as we do to the able-bodied athletes.
Yeah, big discussion around mobility during the Games. It was great if you didn't have a car going around Paris. The Paralympics, a lot of discussions about the fact that there's so many of the metro stations that are not handicap friendly.
Yeah, well, it reminds you, I think the Paralympics and the Paralympic movement reminds us of the work still to be done for everybody to be included. So it shouldn't be that a Paralympics needs to adjust a city for those who are not able-bodied. So it reminds us that we still have lots of work to do to make sure all of our cities are available and can be used by all people. And increasingly our ageing populations have plenty of people who are carrying all sorts of needs of wheelchairs and mobility issues. They'd like to get around cities too. So the Paralympics push us a bit harder, I think, to look at who is really included in our society and who we celebrate, not just those who are able-bodied.
Yeah, and celebrating athletes is something Australians do particularly well.
We do.
We love our sport here in France.
Yeah.
But during the Olympics, I mean, I met with, for instance, people who'd come all the way from Perth to go see the rowing. You really take it seriously in Australia. What's that about?
Well, historically, we have been one of the great sporting nations. We've always had a per capita success way beyond our population. And I think we take that really seriously as a country. It kind of defines something about us. We're a long way away, of course, from this part of the world. And it takes people 24 hours to come and visit us. So Australians have always been out on the world stage. And sport, whether it's our climate, our access to water, we're swimmers, we're tennis players, netball, team sports, and increasingly in athletics, we're doing very well. But it says something about our national character. We're outdoors people. We love to celebrate sport. It is a national character. And I see that in my job now as Governor General, that wherever I go, there is always sport being played, and increasingly the new sports. And we did well in the Games in BMX and skateboarding, in new disciplines that young people are kind of introducing to those of us that are slightly older, that says there's just a whole new form of sport that connects communities.
Sam Mostyn, you said that you edged out the French in gold medals. But you had a French flag bearer. I mean, Jessica Fox is from Marseille, so what's that about?
So this is part of the enduring friendship between our two nations. I love that there are so many levels of this, that the Fox family were so totally embraced, not just because of the extraordinary athletic prowess of that family and the great successes they've had, but also the French history. Australia, in the last 50 years, has become one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world, underpinned by 65,000 years of First Nations history and the British institutions that came in between. And I think because of that, as a nation, when we see a family that has chosen to be Australian, has French antecedents, we love to celebrate them, and we felt as French as anyone on that day, but we claimed them as ours. So I think that says so much about the French-Australian relationship. I mean, more Australians probably got up to watch those two last basketball games between the men's and women's sides when you were desperately trying to win against the Americans. You had all of Australia barracking for the French in those two games. And I love that about these great sporting events, that we begin to find who our great friends around the world are, and we show up and cheer.
Yeah. And there's going to be Los Angeles, then there's going to be Brisbane.
That's right.
Is Paris such a different city from Brisbane that there are really not that many lessons to draw from these games, or are you seeing things that you can take home with you?
I think what France and Paris taught everybody for future Olympics, and particularly Brisbane, is that you can claim this culturally and you can turn your city into the star of a show without being held to the
So you liked the opening ceremony?
I loved it. I loved it. I thought the panache...
Because there were critics.
There were. I mean, that's people who like to be in stadium. And I think what you did with the Seine and your national cultural institutions, it was so French. It was so Parisian. It was... It gripped us watching the broadcast. We probably saw it better than those sitting in Paris because we were watching this magnificent broadcast. But you taught the world to be so thoroughly proud of your culture, to share that with the world and not be contained by what has always been a stadium event. So I don't know whether Brisbane will think about this, but it would be great to see the city of Brisbane and the area around that part of Queensland celebrated. And we've had one hugely successful Olympics in recent history in 2000 in Sydney, and Sydney shone, and I think Brisbane will shine. But I think the Brisbane Organising Committee would have learnt a lot from, as I say, the panache and the cultural confidence of France in putting on these games.
Because there are doubts about these big events. I know the state of Victoria had to forego hosting the Commonwealth Games in 2026. What's the lesson learned?
So I think the lesson learned there is we can no longer afford to build infrastructure purely for an event every 2 or 4 years. And so the reuse of infrastructure, being smart about the use of the city, thinking about the reuse of infrastructure for housing and making sure that the design of the investment isn't just about that 2 weeks or the 4 weeks with the Paris, but it's also about a long-term commitment to a city. And if you don't do that, you do end up with communities who are very upset about that money being spent just on sport instead of community. And you've shown, or I've seen it with the Olympic Village here just yesterday, that the reuse of the village for housing will be a renewal of the suburb that the village is in. They're the lessons. And also to not just always say yes if you can't afford to host a games. And I think Victoria learnt the lesson that you can get very enthusiastic and sort of think it's going to be all right, but when you look at the numbers and realise how much debt you have to go into to run a games, particularly Commonwealth versus Olympic, hard decision had to be made. So that's an interesting dilemma, I think, for the number of games and whether you can reuse cities and not just go around the world, ensuring that there's more and more infrastructure created than is probably necessary.
Sam Mostyn, you've the new Governor-General since July the 1st of this year.
That's right.
Now, if I understand this correctly, your job, in a sense, is not to make headlines.
That's right.
We know that in France, in Europe, we have different scenarios. In Italy, president is kind of a boring job until there's a constitutional crisis, and then it becomes a super important job.
Yes.
In Germany, it's more hard-baked that they're used to building coalitions, and the constitution makes up for it. And of course, in Britain, the king, his job isn't to do, but to be. Yeah. What's your job?
So my job is ultimately to both be the representative of His Majesty the King, so I'm his representative in Australia, but that's where the relationship, I guess, in terms of advice and counsel from the King himself stops. So I'm a representative, but I'm appointed by an Australian Prime Minister, and I work on the advice and counsel of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. My job is fascinating in that I represent all Australians and get to travel the country and the world occasionally, as we are today, to represent the very best of Australians and look at things that Governors-General should be playing back to the country. When I started, I talked about the fact that I thought we had an absence of care and kindness in our political and policy systems, and communities I felt were yearning for leaders in whatever form, but particularly in high office, to start talking about what does it mean to have a culture of care or a polity of care. And by that I mean, how do we care for those that do the caring? How do we care for each other? How do we engage in strenuous debate with care for civility so that we don't descend into violence and rancour? And how do we care for our civic institutions such that we would want to keep them and invest in them so that we remain stable democracies that are successful and can navigate our way through sometimes things like hung parliaments and a change in the political environment. And I think that is the role of a Governor-General in Australia, is to set a tone of care for our institutions. I'm also the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Defence Force, which kind of amuses my father, who served in the Australian Army for 40 years, that his daughter is now the Commander-in-Chief. And of course, that's not a role where I get to push a button to exercise our troops, but it is one where I represent the very best of our Defence Force and the role that they play in providing peace both in Australia and around the world. So it's a really privileged role to have, and increasingly one where my Prime Minister asked me to behave in a modern, very visible and optimistic frame so that Australians could see the character of Australia represented in the Office of Governor-General.
Sam Mostyn, after the Paralympics, you'll be going to the battlefields of the Somme in the north, commemorations of World War I. Every year, thanks to new technology, they're identifying soldiers who fought more than 100 years ago. They found 7 of them, I know, in Fromelles recently, who are Australian.
Yes.
And again, you mentioned how Australia is really the other side of the world, and yet World War I is so important in the memory of it.
Yeah, and it always will be. Every Australian will tell you that the ceremonies of the commemoration of the Somme, of the loss of Australian lives, we had, I think, over 295,000 soldiers that were involved, volunteer soldiers that were in the First World War on the Western Front. And I think it was around 46,000 who were killed. And we still don't know of the resting place of over 10,000 of those soldiers. And as you say, we're discovering more and more. But in Australia's heart, the French hold a very special place. And most Australians that come to Europe will go to the front, will go to the Somme, will spend time at the Sir John Monash Centre, will commemorate and think about and reflect on that war. But there's these particular personal relationships between the Australian and the French that will endure. I don't see that changing at all.
Because there's this dichotomy between the geographical distance and how near it is to the memory and hearts of Australians. Why is that?
I think these are human experiences that have been passed down by generations, and the sense of friendship, of loss, of the catastrophe of that war and the loss of life, particularly for so many young men at the time, that those stories have continued to play down. And Australians, we went through a difficult time, I think, in the Vietnam War, where there was a movement about should we be in wars anymore? And post that period, we've seen Australians really come back to the notion of very serious commemoration, reinvesting in things like visits to the Somme. We have very special commemorations about the French losses in Australia. To me, it's a people-to-people matter, and people keep recreating these moments and finding stories, as we found with the bodies that have been found, and families who come back for the very first time 3 or 4 generations later and are still tearful and deeply emotional. I will be very moved to represent Australians at Villers-Bretonneux and to lay a wreath in commemoration of the relationship and those lives that were lost, and very mindful that I don't think this will change. I think this deep personal set of relationships between our two countries will endure and hopefully teach us to keep us far away from conflict and to remain peaceful and to commit to peace as a principle, as we've heard from many of those who served on the Western Front.
Well, we're certainly honoured, Australia Governor-General Sam Mostyn, for your visit here to our studios. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.